From FingerLakes1.com and FL1 Radio, this is episode 30, the Sunday Conversation Podcast. Today we are discussing HABs, or algal blooms, or a number of other things that you probably have seen in the headlines over the last 3 to 4 months. Summertime and the fall is prime season for algal blooms, and there have been plenty reported on Seneca Lake, and today that is where our focus is. My guest this hour is Frank DiOrio from Seneca Lake Pure Waters. Frank, welcome back to the program.
Thank you for having me here, Josh.
For those who might not remember or recall since the last time you were here, what is Seneca Lake Pure Waters and what does it do?
Okay, Seneca Lake Pure Waters Association is really a volunteer organization, and our mission is to preserve, protect, and promote lake water quality in Seneca Lake.
All right, so we are now in the closing weeks. Can we say that now, the closing weeks of this particular HAB season, right?
That's a fair statement to make, Josh, although this week we have had a few HABs reported here and there. But for the most part, this year has overlapped last year in terms of timing. We get into HABs, it appears in Seneca Lake early September. As we get towards the end of September, it winds down. So when you get into the detailed statistics around what's happened this past year, it's amazing how it's almost a carbon copy of last year.
Okay, so that was actually going to be one of my main questions was compare this year to last year in terms of the data that you guys have collected, but then also what you guys have sort of anecdotally seen as you have been doing the reporting and the actual search.
Okay, so let's talk high-level numbers. Last year we had 39 confirmed blooms. This year, through the lab, we've had 71 confirmed blooms. And then 16 more blooms, Josh, that are really based on photographic evidence. Our volunteers and our team are very, very good at spotting blooms to the point where we're confident looking at photographs to determine if we have a bloom or not. So we've moved from 39 to 87. I would not want the public to assume Seneca Lake has really moved in the wrong direction and gotten worse. Actually, I believe what's happened is our volunteer workforce continues to strengthen every year and get better and better at spotting HABs. So that's what I attribute to the increase in numbers.
How has that part of it played out and actually happened? How have you guys gotten to a point where those volunteers that you're referencing have gotten that much better at being able to just identify it when it's happening and then actually have that come to fruition and be true when it's tested?
Okay, well, our volunteer force in terms of numbers over the last few years has grown from 40 to 120 volunteers. So just in terms of coverage, we have more coverage. We now survey about 60 miles of the 72 miles of shoreline, and many of these volunteers are back for 2 and 3 and 4 years. So they're very, very good at spotting the blooms. And the other thing that we found, Josh, once a volunteer is trained and actually sampled a bloom, it's something that really sticks in your head for a long time. I know my wife, just being around me, can easily spot blooms. As a matter of fact, did that just a couple weeks ago for a pretty intense bloom. So I think just being trained once and then being a volunteer 1 year, you become very competent. And then after you do that multiple years, you become very, very competent. And then the other thing that's happened this past year, we've expanded our survey window to 7 days a week. Earlier years, we told our volunteers to survey Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. That worked out pretty well. However, a bloom explosion could occur on Wednesday and we would miss it. So we've expanded that window. We've also strengthened our training program. So every year our training gets better. So as a result of that, I think we continue to have the reputation of being number one in the state in terms of quality of program.
Now, obviously, you guys are monitoring for about a month or a little over a month as sort of that peak during that peak season. But that is not the exclusive window when HABs can happen. What did we sort of see in 2019 across the board prior to the core season starting when you guys started testing?
Okay, we did have, as I said, 1 or 2 blooms here or there early August, Josh, and our season goes from August 5th to October 6th. So we're out there a full 9 weeks. So what we see is a couple of blooms here and there. We don't get too worried about that in terms of a major kickoff.
Right.
We then hit an inflection point where we see multiple blooms, and we see blooms around the lake, and then we know that we're really in the middle of the bloom season. And this year that happened on September 5th. Actually, the main bloom season was the 5th through the 21st, and last year it was the 9/4 through 9/8, so 9/18, I'm sorry. So you can see the overlap, and once the season starts, then all of the volunteers know that it's really time to study the shore and report their findings.
So as the season wraps up and you guys sort of look ahead, what are the expectations for the rest of fall, and how do you guys sort of approach that after you're done with the technical reporting window that you guys operate in?
Okay, as we get to the rest of fall, and I am asked this question many times, what do your volunteers do off season? As a matter of fact, Seneca Lake was very late in terms of experiencing any HABs. But we trained our volunteers in June, and they actually would obviously keep an eye on the lake, so we just simply did not see any blooms early on. But then after the season is over, in this case it would be October 6th, many of our volunteers still do live on the lake, so they keep an eye out for us all around the circumference of the lake. In terms of our operations team, we continue to develop new training ideas for next year. We report our results to the DEC. We have review meetings. So the HABs program is really a year-round program. It's not just a 9-week program.
Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, for those watching us on YouTube, I pulled up a video or a map, rather, of where you guys have been spotting the blooms throughout this reporting period. Were there any particular parts of the lake that were more or less susceptible or seemed to be more or less susceptible? Obviously, there's a little bit of gray area there, but
right.
What were you guys sort of seeing throughout the season there?
Well, one thing I don't do, Josh, is say, watch out for this particular area of the lake, because by the time the season gets rolling, we see HABs all around the lake, and we see HABs in the middle of the lake. So there is no particular area. I will say that the last couple of years, the yearly reports started at the north end, but then quickly moved around the lake. And I have a report that comes to my laptop every time somebody files a bloom report, and I can actually see blooms move around the lake once they take off. So there's no particular area to watch out for, Josh. I think the more important thing to do is watch out for HABs in general once we tell you the season has started.
Mm-hmm. Now, you just mentioned even spotting blooms in the middle of the lake.
Yes.
That might seem to go against some folks' conventional wisdom or conventional thoughts, I guess, on algae in general, that it might be in shallow waters close to the shoreline. Walk us through that sort of how that happens and why maybe that happens, or what you're seeing.
Okay. Well, as you know, Josh, warm conditions, calm water conditions, lots of sunlight. Yeah. That's what the HABs like. Mm-hmm. So given a volunteer workforce of 120 people, people do their assigned areas at the shoreline, but then they go out and recreate in boats, right? Yeah. And they're not going to stop looking because they're out in the middle of the lake. So they spot the HABs and actually sample the HABs, and we process that just like any other sample. Why is it occurring in the middle of the lake? My own opinion on that, Josh, is the wind moves the HABs around. They can move themselves, but I think the wind also moves them around. So depending on currents, it could very well go from the west side to the east side. And as a matter of fact, as I follow all the bloom reports, I might see it in the southeast, and then later that day we may have reports on the west side. So I think there's a wind condition that comes into play, and also all the other parameters that you mentioned. So it can go wherever the ideal conditions occur, and some of that may mean moving across the middle of the lake.
And I want you to expand a little more, touch on a little more detail in terms of something that you mentioned off the top, which is that just because there are more reports, or there have been more reports this year, it does not necessarily mean that there is a worse problem or that the problem is getting worse.
That's right.
Expand on that a little bit, because
Okay.
I think that might be one of the common myths that we see in the news. Every time there's an article about it, people are saying, oh my God,
Right.
I can't even go in Seneca Lake. That's
Right.
clearly not the
You,
case.
you may see Cayuga Lake, 44 blooms, or Seneca Lake, now 71. So people should not use that as a barometer of when and when not to go into the lake. And also, Josh, along those lines, I'm always very, very suspicious when I hear folks report, well, my lake doesn't have any HABs, because my follow-on question is, describe your volunteer workforce that goes out and monitors HABs. So in many cases, lakes just have not developed their programs and therefore think that they don't have HABs. But if you look at things like the DEC website, you'll see over 100 lakes are reporting HABs. Also, just because of my connection to HABs, I get articles from all over the country, as a matter of fact, all over the world. And my son lives out in Portland, Oregon, and he sends me a steady stream of articles on HABs and dogs that have been injured and unfortunately in some cases passed away because of HABs. Okay, so I don't think there's any particular pattern or any lake that's worse than another. Now, of course, if a lake is shallow and heavy with nutrients, there's a very, very high probability they're going to have HABs, and they're going to have them earlier in the season than we see on Seneca Lake. There's also theories around zebra mussels and quagga mussels that are coming into play, especially when we see lakes like Skinny Atlas, even Keuka, Hemlock, who's reported a HAB this year. We know those are low nutrient lakes, yet they experience blooms. So I think there's still lots of mysteries out there in terms of the whys and wherefores of HABs.
So to that end, what do we know about HABs in terms of what makes them happen and what sort of the nutrient makeup is that is sort of crucial or important to seeing HABs develop?
Okay, well, phosphorus and nitrogen are two key ingredients that chemists and others have proven are related to HABs. But how do those nutrients get to the HABs? Well, this is where we get into stormwater runoff, septic systems, wastewater treatment plants. So there's a lot of contributors that can bring those nutrients down to the lake. They then settle in the lake bottom, and then if the right conditions occur, they react with the sun, the calm water, the warm water, and we have HABs.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the public awareness, which is obviously an element that you guys are really heavily involved with, keeping residents informed. That said, as I scroll through Facebook and Twitter and everywhere else throughout the summer, I see plenty of pictures of green water or, or things that people believe are HABs, obviously unconfirmed, not tested. But is there sort of like a double edge to that sword in terms of people being more aware, but then also not being fully informed on being able to identify what a HAB actually is or what it actually looks like? Because it does have a very specific look to it, right?
Right, and as you point out, seaweed is green as well, right, Josh? So I always tell people when they're looking for HABs, if it appears to be something you can pick up, move on, because it's not a HAB. Okay, so that's one quick test. The other thing is to look for swirls of blue, green looking paint, pea soup, and swirl patterns are also something that are very common with HAB. So I have this conversation often as I walk the shore and do my survey area, and we have all kinds of brochures and pictures available online. So we really encourage everybody to study what they look like, and this, if I can pick it up, it's not a HAB, is a good acid test. The other thing that happens in our case, Josh, having 120 people around the lake, our hotline calls have actually gone down, and we couldn't figure that out at first. But what happens is neighbors talk to neighbors. So we have an awful lot of communications and education that goes on around the whole circumference of the lake because of the size now of our volunteer group.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you guys are looking at different possibilities, different possible reports. What does the process look like? We discussed it a little bit the last time you were here. Walk us through what that process is from start to finish, from when somebody says, I think that might be Hab, to actual lab testing or whatever happens at the end of the process.
All right. So once a week, we require our volunteers to monitor their assigned area. They either spot a bloom or do not spot a bloom. If they do not spot a bloom, they simply turn in a report through their smartphone or on their computer that provides their name, the date, the percent of their zone that they covered, and they hit submit and they get a thank you back. So it's really that simple. If they do find a bloom, they essentially go to another reporting screen where they're asked to take a couple photos of the bloom. They also know that they need to then fill their sample bottle. They do that. They then come home, put the sample bottle in the refrigerator in a brown bag to protect it from light. And then after that, they take their sample to the Finger Lakes Institute up in Geneva. In that lab, we jointly purchased equipment with Canandaigua Lake. And on this piece of equipment called a fluoroprobe, a sample is put in there. We look for greater than 25 micrograms per liter of blue-green algae, and if it's over that threshold, it's a confirmed bloom. And then, based on other criteria, we decide if we want to inspect the sample for toxins. If we do, we then send it over to Syracuse Upstate Freshwater Institute, where they process for toxins. And all of that data then comes back to us, Josh, and we publish that online. And this is probably the most important point that I'd like to make to the public. And that is, you should go on senecalake.org and click on the HABS link. And what you will see there is a data table that shows everything about that sample. When it was collected, what area of the lake it was collected in, what the results are coming back from the Finger Lakes Institute. So maps are nice, and most lakes have maps, just like ourselves. But we've moved a step further into this real-time reporting and a data table, so people can get more specifics more quickly.
And to sort of give folks an idea of the scope of how these individual reports can vary. Give us a sort of an example of like the worst test or the worst example of HABs that you guys saw this year versus maybe one of the more minor ones that came and went quickly.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, in terms of the variability of reports from a pure reporting perspective, we don't always require the volunteers to do 100% of their area, which could be anywhere from a half mile to a mile. So they can submit a report saying they've completed 25% or 50% of their area, and that's perfectly acceptable. There's a good chance that whatever they see in 25% is also occurring across 100% of their area. Now, in terms of the samples themselves, we see wide variability. Some would appear light green in a sample bottle if you shake it up, Josh. Others would be a pretty intense green. And of course, the folks in the lab's technicians can almost look at the color and judge how intense it is, as can some of our more experienced shoreline volunteers. So there's variability there. The other thing that is really amazing the last couple of years, we've had occasion to experience blooms in what I'll call rather clear water. Of course, the spilled paint pea soup arrangement that I described is becoming more and more familiar to a lot of people. But we've had some blooms where the water is just a little cloudy, and it still has proven to be a confirmed bloom. So we continue to learn more about appearance and where you should and where you should not sample.
Is that, as a layman, is that concerning? It
is concerning to me, Josh, because there is no doubt in my mind that the public in general around Seneca Lake is very well aware of the spilled paint, green paint. I think it's another level of understanding to get to sort of the cloudy water situation, and we're going to continue to work on that. But the point I'll emphasize is once you hear from Pure Waters that the bloom season has started, and then we will also tell you when the bloom season has ended, be very, very cautious. And go to that data table that I talked about. I know I have 2 small grandchildren, and of course I get all the information from the lake. But if I weren't in the position I'm in, I would go to that table, look at the results, and make a good judgment around my pets and my children and things like that. So that would be my best recommendation.
And when you guys look at, and of course, I'm just sort of looking for general thoughts here. Are we making, as a state, as different organizations tend to get more involved in the whole reporting process, are we getting more knowledgeable or equally as knowledgeable as we should be about this issue? Or is there so much that's still a mystery that we're still years possibly away from really understanding what's going on here?
Well, I think we're ways off. I hate to say that, Josh, but I think we're really a ways off from understanding. I think our data collection processes have really evolved nicely, not only on Seneca Lake, but on other lakes and across the DEC. So I think we're pretty darn good at collecting data. But understanding the causal factors for HABs is another deal. I know some of the top researchers are surprised. I'm surprised. Every time you begin to point fingers at nutrients, you get a nutrient-poor lake that has a bloom. So these things are 3 billion years old, and they're pretty smart. And we just have the right conditions nowadays that cause them to come to the surface. I think we're going to be a while figuring out how we counter the whole situation and really get rid of them. I think that's a ways off, and it's going to require cooperation across everyone, I believe, to really have an impact. We have homeowners. Just yesterday, my neighbor was having their septic inspected, Josh, but is that happening all around the lake? And you have over 42 municipalities with different rules and guidelines. Are they part of SWIO? We have 20 that have signed up, but we need all 42. So you have municipalities, you have homeowners, you have farmers, you have wastewater treatment plants. All of that has to play together to have an impact on this.
How do you guys cope with the prospect that maybe there isn't a solution to this per se, in the traditional sense where they're eradicated someday, and that it is simply something that folks who live and play and recreate in the lakes are just going to have to deal with?
Our number one goal and our mission is really to keep people and pets safe. I mean, in the near term, I think that's the best thing we can do. And along those lines, someday we see ourselves acting as sort of HABs forecasters, just like you see weather forecasters, Josh. And along those lines, the Tripp Foundation approved a grant for us to put dock stations around the lake. We have 8 of those spaced around the lake, and we also sample water at 4 of the 8 stations. And we're trying to collect research data that will allow us to better understand why HABs occur, but more importantly, the conditions that cause them to occur, so that we could essentially post a forecast. We're in the middle of the bloom season. Be very, very careful. And here's some pictures of blooms that we've sampled recently. So we want to be proactive in terms of reporting. At the same time, collect data that we can provide to the researchers that will help them better determine why and where they are happening.
Has forecasting gotten a little easier as you guys have gained expertise and obviously a greater fleet of volunteers who are looking and on the lookout for this?
I'm not a chemist or a scientist, but it's easier for me, Josh, because over the last 4 years or so, I've become attuned to the conditions that promote HABs, and my place is right on the lake, so I can watch the surface of the lake and what's going on. It's not too hard for me to predict when I'm going to have a busy day and when I'm not going to have a busy day, just looking at the conditions. If I look out there and I see whitecaps, as an example, from a HABs perspective, it's sort of a day off, because they don't form very often in very rough water. Right. If it's going to be a very cool day like today, when I walk outside and I need a coat or a jacket, most likely I won't see a HAB. Not guaranteed, because they have spotted HABs in the winter in some areas. Okay. But there's certain conditions that they're most likely not going to happen. You can't guarantee it. So that it's an experience base that we have, and now we're going to have more data to help us with the prediction challenge.
Curious minds would love to know how many of those off days that you described, those days where there's whitecaps or temperatures are such that or it's raining, that you're not concerned or that there isn't as big of a concern versus those days where you're saying, oh, yeah, today's one of those days I'm going to have to be on lookout. What percentage, how does that sort of percentage break down, say, from when people are normally on the lake? So think June through September when people are busy and they're on their boats or they're swimming or whatever the case may be.
Well, again, with the data and the volunteer force that we're on top of, if it's June or July in our case, I take my boat out in the middle of the lake and often go for a swim, Josh. So personally, I just wait for the bloom season to start. Then maybe I'm overly cautious once it does start.
Right.
And when people visit my place, I'm very careful in terms of whether or not I suggest they go in the water, which has really had an effect on me because I moved in 1992 on the lake, and I never ever thought I'd experience a time where I would tell somebody visiting on a Saturday or Sunday, you probably shouldn't go in the water. But I think that time is here now. And you have to be smart and educated. And I think the other thing people have to realize is it isn't that Seneca Lake is the worst or Keuka Lake is the worst or Cayuga. It's just that all of those lakes experience the conditions that are going to cause them to happen at different times. So everybody needs to be careful.
Is there a cultural shift that we've sort of seen around the lakes where folks are more aware, perhaps a little overcautious, as you described before, about what's happening or what could be happening beneath the surface of the waters?
And I see that happening even with our volunteer force, as good as they are, Josh. Yeah. Early on, as you get towards beginning of August, we see samples come in, and I'm wondering, could it really be a HAB? So people anticipate this now in a big way, Josh, even if our volunteers who are well trained. So they're sort of chomping at the bit here to understand when are these things going to start. And again, that's really an important point. When does the season start, and when do we declare it pretty much over?
And you did mention a little while ago they have happened in the winter before.
They have
rare
happened
circumstance.
In the winter. We don't sample in the winter. However, we do sea slaps sampling, and there's other things that Hobart does, and also the DEC.
Right.
So they have spotted HABs in the winter. I can't tell you where and exactly when, but I know that that's been mentioned before.
And what do you guys see the DEC doing now, and what do you guys hear from them in terms of their efforts and then your guys' efforts and what they sort of see you guys doing and how important that is in the grand scheme of understanding this thing?
Well, I think, as you know, Josh, Governor Cuomo has invested $65 million, and the DEC is working with all the lakes and in the middle of plans, spending that $65 million around a lot of experimentation and testing. We have occasion to get together with the DEC. We have an end-of-the-year review. We have ongoing meetings with them. I mentioned that we're going to have a forum on the 23rd. They may be part of that. So we work very closely with the DEC and share data, and hopefully this data helps them with their experimentation, and hopefully will get us closer to a solution. We also rely very heavily on the DEC for toxin analysis. Remember earlier I mentioned if the sample is over a certain threshold, we send it over to UFI in Syracuse. The DEC pays for that. So I think their program will transition over time. I think one thing they've learned, and Seneca has helped them learn this, Josh, is that once you're mature in terms of your understanding what HABs are all about, you're pretty good at spotting them visually. So do we need to spend a lot of money with extensive sampling? That money might be better spent trying to come up with solutions around how we can stop them from occurring.
And as we close out the half hour here, I'm curious to ask, as HAB season sort of draws to a close, what's the call to action that you're sort of setting out to those who are following you guys? And then also, is this when you guys try to shift the eyes and the ears that are on the HABs onto other issues related to lake health and water quality around Seneca Lake?
Okay, well, as this season winds down, this is what I would call the live volunteer monitoring season. We really move heavily into a data analysis phase where we try and summarize all of our results. We work with the DEC, we talk with other lakes, we try and arrive at some conclusions for our year, but we also begin planning for the next year. As an example, we mentioned blooms in the middle of the lake. Well, what might we do about that? Well, we might expand our monitoring program, our sampling program to the middle of the lake. One of the volunteers is a pilot and has taken some interesting aerial views showing where blooms are occurring, which, by the way, correlates with our sampling. And no surprise there, right? So we may get into more aerial monitoring as well. So we'll move very heavily into a planning phase. We'll move into a stage where we'll have discussions with the DC, and we'll just try and help the cause best we can and start planning for next year, get our training ready, and then the whole cycle repeats itself.
And you'll be back at it again. Frank, we really appreciate you coming in. One more time, where can folks find you guys online, the web address?
Please go to senecalake.org. It's as simple as that. And with all that's going on and everything that I described here today, we really need everyone's help. And if you're not a member of Pure Waters, please make sure and sign up. And all you have to do is go to the upper right-hand corner, click on Join. It's that simple. And we really do need your support.
Frank DiOrio, appreciate the time. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you, Josh.